This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is not affiliated with or endorsed by the U.S. Navy or Department of Defense. The smoke came first. Not the lazy blue kind that drifts off a campfire or curls from a chimney on a cold morning. This was something else entirely. Thick, chemical tasting, the color of wet concrete. It rolled through the piñon trees in waves, swallowing the trail ahead, turning the afternoon into something closer to dusk. Commander Rowan Hale, retired, didn't stop moving. He couldn't. The man slung across his shoulders, Tomas, 26 years old, 180 pounds of dead weight with a mangled left leg, groaned every time the terrain shifted beneath Rowan's boots. The sound was muffled by the cloth wrapped around both their faces, but it carried. Pain always carried. Rowan's left shoulder screamed. Old shrapnel. 8 years embedded, 6 years removed, the nerve damage permanent. Every step sent a hot wire from the joint down through his forearm, but his grip didn't loosen. Grip was the last thing to go. They'd taught him that at Coronado, back when the ocean was the thing trying to kill him. 20 paces ahead, Mesa stopped. The German shepherd planted all 4 legs on the trail and turned back, ears flat, amber eyes locked on Rowan through the haze. The dog's mouth was closed. No panting, no sound. Just that look, the one that said, "Wrong direction." "Talk to me," Rowan said through the cloth. Mesa didn't bark. Instead, the dog angled his body right, toward a narrow gap between 2 boulder outcrops that Rowan hadn't seen through the smoke. Then he looked back again, waiting. Rowan adjusted his grip on Tomas, felt the young man's breathing, shallow but steady. Behind them, somewhere in the gray wall of smoke, a tree cracked. The sound was sharp and percussive, like a rifle shot echoing off canyon walls. Then a second crack, longer, deeper, the slow splitting of a trunk giving way. "Move!" Rowan barked. He cut right, following Mesa through the gap. His right knee buckled on a loose stone, the old injury flaring. ACL, twice repaired, never quite right. But he caught himself and kept driving forward. Behind him, the tree hit the ground exactly where they'd been standing. The impact sent a shudder through the earth, followed by a rush of heat and embers that peppered the air like thrown sparks. Mesa was already through the gap, turning again, checking. Lead check. 20 paces ahead. Turn. Confirm. Wait. The dog had done this since the day Rowan brought him home from the VA program. Some dogs fetched. Some dogs sat. Mesa mapped escape routes. The smoke thinned slightly on the other side of the boulders. Enough to see 30 yards. Enough to see that the trail they needed was already burning. Rowan stopped. His legs were shaking, not from fear, from load. He lowered Tomas carefully against a flat rock, checked his pulse, checked his breathing, checked the bandage on his leg. All holding. Barely. Mesa came back and pressed his full weight against Rowan's thigh. 40 kilograms of dog, solid and warm, pushing into him with a pressure that was deliberate and familiar. Grounding. The dog's way of saying, "You're here. Stay here. Rowan put one hand on Mesa's neck, let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The smoke shifted. Somewhere above them, the fire was rewriting the landscape, turning everything he'd built over 14 months into fuel. 72 hours earlier, none of this existed. The morning was clean. That was the word Rowan used for mornings like this. Mornings where the sky over the New Mexico high plateau stretched so wide and empty that the light seemed to come from everywhere at once. No clouds, no wind, just the dry mineral smell of juniper and dust, and a silence so complete that the sound of Mesa's paws on the gravel path was the loudest thing for a mile. Rowan walked the rows at 0540, same as every morning. The pinyon saplings stood in measured lines along the restoration site, each one staked and tagged with a small metal marker bearing a date and a soil composition code. 14 months of work. 800 acres of land that the Conservation Trust had written off as too degraded to recover. Alkaline soil, collapsed root structures, decades of erosion that had stripped the mesa down to something closer to pavement than earth. He'd taken it anyway. Not because anyone asked. Not because the numbers said it would work. Because the land was a problem. And problems were the only currency he still understood. The camp sat on a flat shelf of packed earth at the north end of the site, 12 miles outside the town of Piedra Seca. 4 canvas and frame tents, an equipment shed with a corrugated metal roof, and a table outside Rowan's tent where he kept his charts weighted down with river stones. Everything had a position. Tools on the pegboard arranged by size, water containers lined against the shed wall, refill dates marked in black pen. The schedule pinned to the tent post, updated nightly, with each crew member's sector and task for the following day written in Rowan's careful, block-letter hand. He'd arranged his own tent the same way, the cot against the north wall, pack on the floor within arm's reach, boots beside the cot facing the door. Mesa's bed, a folded wool blanket, was positioned between the cot and the tent entrance. It was the same layout he'd kept in every FOB he'd ever slept in. Some habits weren't habits. They were architecture. Mesa moved beside him, nose working the base of each sapling, pausing at one to paw lightly at the soil before moving on. The dog had his own inspection protocol. Rowan had stopped questioning it after the 3rd month, when Mesa had flagged a section of saplings that turned out to have a fungal infection 2 weeks before the lab results confirmed it. "Good boy," Rowan said, his voice dropping into something quieter than the one he used for everything else. "What do you see?" Mesa's ear twitched. He moved to the next row. Rowan followed, pulling a small notebook from his chest pocket and marking a number beside a sapling code. Survival rate, 82%, up from 61 at the 6-month mark. The trench irrigation system he'd designed, shallow channels following the natural grade of the mesa, guiding water instead of flooding it, was working better than the Trust's original spec. He'd redesigned it 3 times. Control was the thing. You measured, you adjusted, you didn't guess. Back at camp, he ran the morning brief at 0700 sharp. 4 men stood in a loose semicircle outside the equipment shed. All veterans, all hired through the Trust's workforce program. Dex Harlan, former Marine, 41, built like he'd been assembled from bridge cables, said nothing and missed nothing. Tomas Marsh, 26, former Army medic, still carried the jumpy energy of someone recently separated. Two others, Briggs and Paulson, older, steadier, both on their second careers. Sector 4 needs the East Channel cleared before noon, Rowan said. No preamble, no warm-up. Tomas, you're on porter duty for Dr. Alderman. She's running samples in Sector 7 today. Dex, North Perimeter check. Briggs, Paulson, irrigation maintenance, South Grid. He assigned tasks the way he'd run briefings for 21 years. Clear, specific, no ambiguity. Each man knew his lane. Each man moved without being asked twice. The SUV arrived at 0900. Rowan heard it before he saw it. The particular crunch of oversized tires on the access road, moving too fast for the terrain. He stepped out of the equipment shed, Mesa at his heel, and watched the vehicle pull into the camp clearing. Garrett Lund stepped out, wearing pressed khakis and a Meridian Land Trust polo shirt, a leather portfolio under one arm, and a smile that arrived slightly before the rest of his face. Rowan, Lund extended his hand. Quarterly check-in. Thought I'd come out instead of doing this over email. Rowan took the handshake, brief, measured. Didn't expect you until Thursday. Moved some things around. Brought supplies, too. Water filters, new soil probes, the ones you requested. Lund gestured toward the SUV's trunk. Figured the crew could use some fresh gear. He was good at this. The smile, the supplies, the first-name familiarity. Lund moved through the camp like he owned it, because technically, through the trust, he did. He shook hands with Briggs and Paulson, clapped Dex on the shoulder. Dex tolerated it the way he tolerated most things, silently, with his jaw set. Then Lund turned to Rowan. The field surveyor, Alderman, she's still running samples out here? She's heading to Sector 7 today, Rowan said. Quarterly soil analysis. 7. Lund nodded slowly, making a note in the portfolio. That's the far section, right? Near the bluff face? Copy. Mesa had not moved from behind Rowan's legs since Lund arrived. The dog had greeted Briggs with a tail wag that morning. He'd let Tomas scratch behind his ears before the brief. When the supply truck driver had come through last Wednesday, Mesa had trotted over and sniffed his boots before returning to his spot by the equipment shed. Normal behavior. Social. Curious. But with Lund, nothing. Mesa stood behind Rowan's right calf, ears level, body still, eyes tracking Lund's every movement with the kind of fixed attention that wasn't aggressive, but wasn't relaxed either. When Lund stepped closer, Mesa shifted his weight slightly, angling his body between the two men. Rowan didn't notice. He was used to Mesa being particular about strangers. Some people the dog liked, some he didn't. It wasn't a system Rowan had ever figured out. Lund closed the portfolio. Looking good out here, Rowan. Really good. The board's impressed with the survival numbers. Should be. The work's sound. That it is. Lund glanced once more toward the southeast, the direction of Sector 7, then walked back to the SUV. I'll be in the area a couple days. Call if you need anything. Rowan watched the SUV pull away, dust trailing behind it like a signature. Mesa's eyes followed it until it disappeared over the ridge. Then, and only then, the dog moved away from Rowan's leg and returned to his spot by the shed, She arrived the next afternoon. A white, county-tagged Jeep came up the access road at a reasonable speed, unlike Lund's entrance the day before, and parked in the shade of the equipment shed. The door opened, and Dr. June Alderman stepped out, carrying a hard-sided sample case in one hand and a replacement soil probe in the other. She was 41, lean in the way of someone who worked outdoors but forgot to eat regularly, with sun-darkened skin and brown hair pulled back in a knot that had started the day tidy and had since given up. She wore field clothes, boots, cargo pants, a long-sleeved shirt with the Meridian logo on the pocket, and moved with the efficient, slightly distracted energy of someone whose mind was already 2 tasks ahead of her body. There was something else, too. Something Rowan recognized because he carried the same thing, just packaged differently. A careful economy of movement. The way she scanned the camp when she stepped out of the Jeep. Not hypervigilant, but aware. The way someone who had learned that the world could change without warning paid attention to the world. She didn't linger on any one spot, didn't stare, just noted, cataloged, filed. She'd been doing this for 18 months. Before that, Rowan knew from the project file she'd spent 3 years working exclusively from lab environments. No field work, no site visits, just data analysis behind a desk, which was unusual for someone with her publication record in restoration ecology. There was a gap in her career timeline that lined up with a date he'd noticed on her emergency contact form. A date that sat alone, with no name beside it. Just a date and the word deceased. Rowan was reviewing soil data at the table outside his tent when she walked up. Mesa sat 3 feet away, watching her with ears forward and tail neutral. Interested, not guarded. "Hale," she said. Not Commander, not Mr. Hale, not Rowan. Just the surname, delivered like a fact. He looked up. Dr. Alderman. "June." She set down the sample case. "I've been working this site for 18 months. I think we're past formalities." Rowan wiped his hands on a rag, said nothing. He assessed. It was automatic now, the way his eyes catalogued details without his permission. No wedding ring. Tan line where one used to be. Eyes steady but tired in a way that went deeper than sleep deprivation. She carried the sample case like it mattered more than the probe, which was the expensive piece. "Your equipment came in," he said. "Tomas will porter for you to 7. "Good. The last probe was destroyed by wildlife." She made the quotation marks with her fingers. "According to the Trust's incident report. Things break out here. Soil probes don't get dragged 40 feet from their mounting stakes by coyotes, Hale." Rowan didn't answer. He filed it. The probe. 40 feet. The way she said it. Not angry, not paranoid. Just precise. Like a data point she hadn't found a place for yet. Mesa stood and walked to June, sniffing her boots, then her hand. She held still, not reaching down, not pulling away. Patient. The dog circled once, then sat beside her and looked at Rowan. "Your dog likes me better than you do," she said. "He likes everyone. He didn't like the man in the khakis yesterday." Rowan looked at her. She was watching Mesa, not him. Her expression was neutral, observational. The same face she probably wore when analyzing soil composition, collecting information, waiting for a pattern to emerge. He turned back to the valve. Tomas will meet you at the trailhead at 0600. She picked up her case. I'll be ready. And Hale, if my new probe gets eaten by a coyote, I'm billing your department. She walked toward the crew quarters without waiting for a response. Mesa watched her go, ears forward, tail giving a single slow wag that Rowan caught from the corner of his eye. He tightened the valve and said nothing. The fire started at 13:47. Rowan knew the time because he checked his watch when Mesa's head came up. A sharp, sudden movement, ears rotating forward, body going rigid in the way that had nothing to do with wildlife and everything to do with threat. He was reviewing soil data at the table outside his tent when it happened. The afternoon was hot, still, unremarkable. The kind of day where the plateau baked under a sky so wide and clear it seemed hostile. Briggs and Paulson were running south grid maintenance. Dex was checking the north perimeter. Tomas had left with June at 0600 for Sector 7, the far section, 6 miles out along the bluff trail. Mesa stood. Not a casual rise, an explosive one, all 4 legs beneath him at once, nose pointed south, body locked. What is it? The dog didn't look at him. 3 sharp barks, clipped, urgent, directional. Mesa barked at coyotes with a low, sustained rumble. At snakes, a single warning snap. This was different. This was alarm. Rowan stood and walked to the south edge of camp. He didn't run. Running was for people who hadn't learned to assess first. He scanned the horizon, left to right, systematic, the way he'd scanned 1,000 ridgelines downrange. There, southeast. A column of smoke, pale gray at the base, darkening as it climbed, leaning northeast with the upper altitude wind. Distance, maybe 4 miles, maybe less. Hard to tell on the plateau where the air played tricks with scale. He watched for 10 seconds. The column widened. Not a campfire, not a controlled burn. Too much volume, too fast. The base was dark, almost black. Heavy fuel, high heat. The angle of the lean told him wind speed at altitude, 12 to 15 knots northeast. Ground level was calmer, but that would change. Fire created its own weather. 21 years of reading terrain, from the Hindu Kush to the Horn of Africa, had taught him to see landscapes as systems. Wind, fuel, elevation, moisture. The variables were different here, but the logic was the same. And the logic said this fire was going to move fast, burn hot, and eat everything between here and the county road within 4 hours. Rowan moved, back to the tent, grabbed the satellite phone, punched in the county fire dispatch number. Static. He tried again. Static. The repeater tower was south of camp, south, where the smoke was. He checked the radio. Same result. Dead air where there should have been a channel. Briggs, Paulson. His voice carried across the camp without shouting. Both men appeared from the south grid within 60 seconds. Fire, southeast, 4 miles, moving northeast with the wind. Briggs looked at the smoke. His face changed. Road 12 runs southeast. I know. Road 12 was the only road out. It ran southeast from camp to the county highway, directly through the fire's apparent path. If the fire reached the road before they did, there was no vehicle exit. Tomas and Dr. Alderman are in Sector 7, Rowan said, 6 miles out on the bluff trail. No radio. The words hung in the heat. 6 miles, on foot, through terrain that was about to burn. Rowan's hands were steady. His breathing was even. Inside, the machine that had run for 21 years, the one that took chaos and converted it into actionable steps, engaged the way it always had. Assess, plan, execute. Briggs, Paulson, take the truck south on Road 12. If the road's clear, drive to the county highway and call dispatch. If it's blocked, turn back and meet me at the North Ridge trailhead. And you? Briggs asked. I'm going to 7. He didn't explain further. Didn't need to. 2 people were 6 miles away with no communication and a fire between them and camp. Rowan moved through the tent in 30 seconds. Water, 4 liters in the pack. First aid kit, the real one, not the trust-issued plastic box, but the one he'd built himself. The one with the tourniquet and the hemostatic gauze and the chest seals that no conservation program had any reason to stock, but that Rowan kept anyway, because preparation wasn't paranoia. Preparation was the space between dying and not dying. Mesa, here. The dog was already at his side, had been since the first bark. Fuss. Mesa fell in at his left heel, close enough that Rowan could feel the dog's shoulder brush his calf with each step. They moved north, away from camp, toward the bluff trail that would loop east and then south to Sector 7. Behind them, Briggs and Paulson's truck fired up and headed for Road 12. The engine sound faded quickly in the open air. Ahead, the smoke column grew. They covered the first 2 miles at a pace Rowan hadn't set since his last deployment. Not running. You didn't run on uneven terrain with a loaded pack unless you wanted a broken ankle, but a fast, grinding walk that ate distance without burning reserves. The kind of movement that came from years of rucking through mountains where the altitude tried to kill you and the terrain tried to finish the job. Mesa moved ahead in his pattern. 20 paces, turn, check, wait. The dog's efficiency was almost mechanical. No wasted movement, no distraction. When a jackrabbit broke from a scrub clump 10 feet to the right, Mesa's head tracked it for half a second, then dismissed it. Irrelevant, not a threat. The trail climbed along a ridgeline that paralleled the bluffs, offering occasional views of the plateau below. Each time Rowan crested a rise, he stopped and checked the fire. It was moving faster than he'd estimated. The juniper flats to the south were catching like kindling, dry, resinous wood that had been baking under 6 weeks of drought. Individual trees flared into bright columns of orange, throwing embers that leaped ahead of the main fire line and started spot fires in the scrub. The smoke was thickening. Even at this distance, Rowan could taste it. The bitter, woody char that coated the back of the throat and turned breathing into a conscious act. At mile 3, the trail dropped into a shallow canyon. The air was clearer here, shielded by the rock walls. Rowan paused, took 2 pulls from the water bladder, poured a handful into his palm, and held it down. Drink. Mesa lapped the water without breaking his scanning pattern, tongue working while his eyes continued to move, checking the ridgeline, the trail ahead, the narrow strip of sky above the canyon walls. When the water was gone, the dog looked up. Ready. 3 more miles, Rowan said. He wasn't talking to the dog. He was talking to the math in his head, the speed equation that balanced their pace against the fires, with two variables he couldn't control: wind direction and fuel density. If the wind held northeast, the fire would sweep the southern flats and potentially cut across Sector 7's access trail within the next 2 hours. If the wind shifted, and on the plateau, wind always shifted, the timeline compressed. He didn't know if Tomas and June had seen the smoke. Sector 7 sat in a natural bowl below the bluff face, shielded from the south by a rock ridge. Depending on wind, they might not smell it until the fire was on top of them. "Move!" Mesa was already walking. They pushed through the canyon and back up onto the ridge trail. The smoke was visible from here in a way it hadn't been before. Not a column anymore, but a wall. The southern horizon had disappeared behind a curtain of gray and brown that turned the sunlight amber and cast everything in a flat, shadowless haze. Rowan's eyes watered. He pulled the neck gaiter up over his nose and mouth, adjusting it into a makeshift filter. It cut the taste, but not the burn. Mesa was panting now, the dog's primary cooling system, and the smoke wasn't helping. Easy, steady. A mile from Sector 7, the trail narrowed and dropped into a series of switchbacks that cut down toward the bluff base. The pinyon trees were thicker here, older growth that the trust hadn't touched. Their canopy blocked the sky, and the smoke filtered through like fog, diffusing the light into something gray and even and dead. Rowan heard them before he saw them. "Hail!" June's voice, coming from below and to the right, somewhere in the pinon break. "Here, on the trail!" They appeared through the smoke 30 seconds later. June first, moving fast, the sample case still in her hand. Tomas behind her, limping, his face tight with pain, one arm braced against a pinon trunk. Rowan reached them in 6 strides. His eyes went to Tomas first, automatic, the way a medic's did. The left leg. The cargo pants were torn below the knee, darkened with blood that had already started to dry at the edges. "What happened?" "Deadfall," Tomas said through clenched teeth. "A pinon trunk. It came down when the wind hit." "When?" 20 minutes ago. Maybe 30. Rowan crouched and examined the leg without asking permission. His hands moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing this in places where hesitation cost lives. Dusty compounds where the nearest surgical team was a helicopter ride and 40 minutes away, and the 40 minutes were the part that killed you. He cut the fabric away with his knife, clean, fast, 2 strokes. The wound was a deep laceration along the shin, ragged-edged, still seeping. No bone visible, no arterial spray. But the tissue around it was already swelling, and the way Tomas flinched when Rowan palpated above the knee told him there was deeper bruising tracking upward. "Not broken," Rowan said, "but the tissue damage is significant. You're going to swell, and the swelling will compress the nerve above the ankle. Walking's going to get hard, and it's going to get harder the longer we wait." He opened his pack and worked. Hemostatic gauze packed into the wound, pressure bandage wrapped tight, secured with tape. 12 seconds from open pack to sealed wound. He didn't count. His hands counted for him. They'd dressed wounds in the dark, in the cold, in the back of vehicles moving over terrain that didn't deserve the word road. The context changed. The mechanics didn't. "Breathe," he told Tomas. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Slow." Mesa had positioned himself beside Tomas during the treatment. not watching Rowan work, but pressing his flank against the young man's uninjured leg. The dog's breathing was slow and deliberate, almost performative, as if demonstrating the rhythm he wanted Tomas to follow. June stood 3 feet away. She hadn't put down the sample case, hadn't dropped it, hadn't shifted it to the other hand. She held it the way you held something that mattered more than comfort. "How bad is the fire?" she asked. Rowan stood and looked south. The smoke was denser now, the taste sharper. Through the pinyon canopy, he could see an orange glow along the southern ridge. Not flames yet at this distance, but the light of them, reflected off the smoke like a false sunset. "It's between us and camp. Road 12 is likely cut. Briggs and Paulson were heading for the highway. If they made it, dispatch knows. If they didn't, no one knows." June processed this the way she processed data, quickly, without visible panic. Her jaw tightened, but her breathing stayed even. "So we're on foot." "We're on foot," Rowan confirmed. "North route, Pinyon Ridge. It'll add 4 miles, but the Pinyon burns slower than the Juniper Flats. It's a buffer." "I can walk," Tomas said. He put weight on the leg, and his face went white. He didn't fall. He didn't quit either. Rowan watched him, assessed. The kid could move, but not fast. Not fast enough. He recalculated. 4 miles of ridge trail at Tomas's pace meant 3 hours minimum. The fire at its current spread rate would reach the ridge in 2. The math didn't work. But the alternative, staying here, worked less. "Dex is at the north perimeter. If we make the ridge, we'll find him." He adjusted the pack on his shoulders. The left one burned. He ignored it. "Tomas, you're behind me. June, behind Tomas. If he stumbles, you catch him. Mesa." The dog was already at the trail's edge, looking north, ears forward, body ready. He'd heard the plan before it was spoken, or maybe he'd smelled the fire and drawn the same conclusion. Fuss. Mesa fell in. The group moved. Behind them, the orange glow on the southern ridge brightened. The fire was eating its way north, and it wasn't slowing down. The Pinyon Ridge Trail climbed through older growth, trees with thick, gnarled trunks and canopies dense enough to create pools of shade even at midday. The smoke filtered through the branches in layers, turning the light gray and flat, erasing shadows and depth. It was like walking through a photograph that someone had drained of color. Rowan set the pace, fast enough to matter, slow enough that Tomas could keep it. The young man was limping hard now, favoring the right leg, each step on the left accompanied by a sharp intake of breath that he tried to hide and couldn't. June stayed behind him, close enough to catch, but not close enough to crowd. She'd done this before. Not the fire, not the injury, but the walking with someone in pain. Rowan noticed the spacing and filed it. Mesa ran point. 20 paces, turn, check. 20 paces, turn, check. The dog's rhythm was a metronome that kept the group anchored when the smoke erased every other reference point. 40 minutes in, the smoke thickened. Not gradually. It came in a wave, as if someone had dropped a curtain. Visibility collapsed to 15 feet. then 10. The pinyon trunks became gray shapes that materialized and disappeared as the group moved through them. The air turned heavy, abrasive, each breath requiring more effort than the last. Rowan pulled the spare neck gaiter from his pack and handed it to Tomas without breaking stride. "Wet it." He passed the water bladder. June already had a bandana over her nose. Prepared. Another data point. The juniper grove to the east detonated. Not slowly, not with warning. One moment, it was a cluster of dark shapes in the smoke. The next, it was a wall of orange, fire racing through the resinous wood with a sound like fabric tearing. A continuous, crackling roar that pushed a blast of heat sideways through the pinyon understory. Embers flew. Small ones, glowing orange sparks carried on the convection, sailed over the group and landed in the dry scrub 20 meters ahead. One caught. Then another. Mesa barked, sharp, explosive, directional. He spun toward Rowan, then back toward the fire, then toward the group, his body language screaming, "Move now!" "Down!" Rowan shouted. He grabbed the back of June's shirt and pulled her low as a wave of heat rolled overhead. The air above them shimmered and distorted, turning the pinon canopy into a wavering liquid shape. Tomas dropped without being told. Instinct, or maybe training. 5 seconds. 10. The heat pulse passed, drawn upward by the convection column. Move, now, straight ahead, through the burn. The scrub ahead was already catching, but the main fire was behind them. Rowan drove the group forward, through the fresh flames that licked at the ground cover. Low, fast-moving, survivable if you moved faster. Mesa ran ahead, finding the path through the burn where the ground was already charred and cooling. The dog didn't hesitate. He'd been trained to move toward controlled chaos, not away from it. Rowan felt the heat through his boots, smelled singed fabric. June stumbled on a root and he caught her arm. A firm grip, functional, released the moment she was steady. Tomas was moving on adrenaline now, the leg forgotten in the face of something worse than pain. 50 meters. They cleared the burn zone and stumbled into a patch of pinon old growth that the fire hadn't reached yet. The air was smoky, but cooler. The heat fell away like a dropped blanket. Rowan stopped, checked Tomas, breathing hard but upright. June, coughing but steady. Mesa, panting, scanning, already mapping the next segment. June straightened, pulling the bandana down. Her face was streaked with soot. She looked at the burn they'd just crossed, then at the line of fire still visible through the smoke to the east. "Juniper burns fast," she said. Her voice was hoarse but controlled. "Pinon burns slow. The chamisa along the western drainage holds more moisture. If we follow the chamisa line, we stay in the slow burn zone." Rowan looked at her. She was reading the fire the way he read a battle space, not panicking, not guessing, but analyzing the terrain and predicting how the threat would move through it. Fuel density, moisture content, slope and wind, and the physics of combustion mapped onto a landscape she'd been studying for 18 months. "Show me the chamisa line," he said. It was the first time he'd asked instead of told. June pointed west, toward a shallow drainage where the scrub was darker and denser. Mesa was already moving in that direction, nose down, testing the ground. The dog stopped where the soil changed color, slightly darker, slightly damp, even in the drought, and looked back. "He agrees," June said. Rowan almost smiled. Almost. Dex is at the north ridge. We follow the Chamisa. We hit the ridge trail from the west side. 3 miles. He looked at Tomas. The kid's face was gray beneath the soot, but his eyes were focused. He nodded once. Can you make 3 miles? I can make whatever I have to make, Tomas said. The words came out through clenched teeth, but they came out steady. The kid had spine. Rowan had known that since the first week, when Tomas had worked a 12-hour shift in 100-degree heat without complaint, and then asked what needed doing next. Don't be a hero. If the leg gives, you tell me. I need information, not courage. Tomas nodded. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Permission to be honest about pain without it meaning weakness. It was a language most civilians didn't speak, but Tomas had deployed. He understood the difference between quitting and reporting. They moved into the Chamisa corridor in formation. Rowan at point, Tomas second, June at rear, Mesa running his 20-pace lead check pattern ahead. The Chamisa scrub was waist-high and dense, darker green than the surrounding brush, its roots pulling moisture from a subsurface drainage that June said ran along a fault line in the mesa bedrock. The soil underfoot was marginally softer, marginally darker. Not much, but in a fire, margins were the difference. The smoke was everywhere now, not thick enough to blind, but thick enough to erase the horizon and turn the world into a featureless gray tunnel where distance lost all meaning. Rowan navigated by slope and wind. The drainage ran northwest, the wind was pushing northeast, and as long as the ground kept its gentle downhill angle, they were heading the right direction. 40 minutes into the Chamisa line, Rowan heard a sound that stopped him mid-stride. A thin, whistling hiss. The kind of sound that superheated air makes when it moves through a narrow gap. He held up a fist. The group stopped. Mesa was already frozen, 10 paces ahead, ears flat, body low. The sound came from the east. Through the smoke, Rowan could see a dull orange glow. Not distant anymore. Close. The fire had jumped. Embers carried by the convection column had landed in a juniper stand less than 200 meters to their right, and the stand was going up fast. Individual trees ignited in rapid succession, each one throwing a pulse of heat and light that briefly turned the smoke orange before fading back to gray. "Pace up," Rowan said, not shouting. Shouting burned air, and air was currency now. "Stay on the Chamisa. Don't cut east for any reason." They moved faster. Tomas was breathing hard, each exhale carrying a small grunt of pain that he probably thought he was hiding. June had shifted to his left side, not touching him, but close enough that her shoulder would catch him if the leg buckled. She'd done it without being asked, without making it obvious. Rowan noticed. Filed it. The smoke thickened. Rowan's eyes burned. The gator was soaked through with sweat and barely filtering anymore. Mesa's panting had turned ragged. The dog was working at the edge of his tolerance, the smoke attacking his respiratory system harder than it attacked theirs. "Bleib," Rowan said. "Wait." He stopped, pulled the water bladder, poured into his palm. Mesa drank without breaking his scan. Rowan poured again. The dog drank. When Rowan put the bladder away, he had less than a liter left, enough for maybe another hour. The Chamisa line narrowed ahead, funneling between 2 rock outcrops that rose from the mesa floor like broken teeth. Beyond them, if Rowan's mental map was right, The terrain opened into a flat that connected to the North Ridge Trail. Another mile, maybe less. For a moment, just a moment, the smoke shifted, and Rowan caught a glimpse of terrain through the gap between the outcrops. Brown earth, scattered piñon, the dark line of the bluff face to the northwest. And something else. A memory, sudden and uninvited. Another gap between rocks. Another ridge. Different continent, different decade. Walking point through a valley in Helmand. Dawn light, the smell of dust and cordite. The wind had smelled like smoke that morning too. A burn pit somewhere over the next ridge. He'd read the terrain, made the call, led the platoon through. 90 seconds. That's what it had come down to. 90 seconds between the right call and the wrong one, and 3 men who didn't come home. Because 90 seconds was either too many or not enough. And 8 years later, he still didn't know which. The memory flickered and died. The smoke came back, the heat, the present. Mesa was watching him. The dog had stopped his lead check and was standing 6 feet ahead, body angled toward Rowan, head slightly tilted. Not alarmed, attentive, waiting to see if Rowan was here or somewhere else. "I'm here," Rowan said quietly. Mesa's tail moved once. He turned and resumed the lead check. Rowan adjusted the pack. The shoulder burned, the knee ached. The smoke was getting worse, and the fire was getting closer. And the math still didn't work. Not really. Not if you ran the numbers honestly. But the numbers had never been the whole story. 21 years in the teams had taught him that. You plan for what you can measure. You execute through what you can't. Mesa. Fuss. The dog fell in. The group moved through the gap in the rocks, into the corridor beyond, toward the ridge they couldn't see yet, but had to believe was there. Behind them, the Piñon Ridge began to burn. The Chamisa corridor held for 1.5 miles. The scrub grew thick along the drainage line, its gray-green branches pressing against their legs as the group pushed northwest. The soil underfoot was softer here, not wet, but less hostile than the baked hardpan on either side, and the air carried a faint mineral coolness that rose from the subsurface drainage like breath from a well. June had explained it during one of the brief pauses. A fault line in the mesa bedrock channeled snowmelt and residual groundwater along this corridor, even in drought years, feeding the chamisa roots just enough to keep the plants green when everything else went brown. Rowan didn't care about the geology. He cared about the moisture. Moisture meant the fire would move slower here, and slower meant time. And time was the only thing keeping 4 people and a dog on the right side of alive. Mesa moved at the front of the group in his lead check pattern. 20 paces, turn, confirm, wait. The dog's paws found solid ground between the root tangles with a precision that never required correction. Every few minutes, he paused to test the air, nose working, ears rotating. Reading the fire the way Rowan read it, by direction, by intensity, by the subtle shifts in heat and wind that told you whether the threat was holding steady or closing in. It was closing in. Rowan watched the fire the way he'd watched incoming mortar rounds, not with fear, but with the cold, calculating attention of someone trying to predict where the next one would land. The main fire line was still to the south and east, a shifting wall of orange and black that consumed the juniper flats in rolling waves. But the embers were the problem. They sailed on the convection currents like burning confetti, rising high above the flame front and traveling hundreds of meters before falling, still glowing, still hungry, into whatever dry fuel waited below. Twice in the last 20 minutes, spot fires had ignited within 100 meters of the Chamisa line. Both times, the fires had burned sideways into the dry scrub rather than toward the wetter corridor. Both times, Rowan had watched them long enough to confirm the direction, then pushed the group forward without comment. The third time was different. Mesa stopped. Not his usual lead-check pause. This was a full-body lock, all 4 legs planted, head turned hard to the right, ears flat against his skull. The dog's lip curled back from his teeth, but no sound came out. Silent alarm. The kind that meant the threat was close enough that noise would waste the seconds they needed to move. Rowan held up a fist. Behind him, Tomas and June stopped. Then he heard it. A low, rushing hiss from the east, building fast. Not wind. Fire moving through dry fuel at speed, the sound of oxygen being pulled toward a heat source the way water is pulled toward a drain. A sound that started as a whisper and ended as a roar, and the transition happened in about 4 seconds. He saw it a moment later. A cluster of embers, not the small drifting kind that peppered the ground like orange snow, but thick, glowing chunks of juniper bark the size of his fist, sailed over the Chamisa line in a rising arc and landed in a dead piñón standing 20 meters ahead of the group. The trunk caught instantly. Old, dry, hollowed by decades of insects and drought. It went up like a struck match, flames racing from the base to the crown in under 5 seconds, the resin in the wood popping and hissing as it combusted. The heat pulse hit them sideways. Rowan felt it on the right side of his face, a blast furnace wave that dried the sweat on his skin before he could flinch. The air shimmered. The smoke thickened to something almost solid. Down! He grabbed the back of June's shirt with one hand and pulled her flat against the ground. His other hand found Tomas's pack strap and dragged him down beside her. Mesa was already belly low, pressed into the chamisa, ears pinned, body compact. The dog had been down before the command was spoken. He'd read the ember trajectory and made the call himself. The piñón burned above them. Embers rained down, small ones peppering their packs and shoulders, hissing where they landed on the damp chamisa. Rowan felt 2 land on the back of his neck. He brushed them off with the flat of his hand, automatic, trained, a reflex born from nights spent in positions where worse things fell from the sky, and complaining about it wasn't on the list of options. 5 seconds. 10. The convection pulled the fire upward and east, dragging the heat column away from the corridor. The dead piñón collapsed sideways with a crack that echoed off the distant bluffs, falling away from the group, scattering embers across the drainage, but not blocking it. Move! Straight through! Don't stop! They scrambled up and ran. Not a tactical pace, not measured, just ran. 50 meters through smoke and falling ash, boots pounding through hamisa that crackled and snapped underfoot like dry bones. The ground was hot where embers had landed, and Rowan could feel the heat through his boot soles. A dull warmth that said the earth itself was starting to remember what it was like to burn. Mesa sprinted ahead, found the clear ground beyond the immediate burn zone, and turned, barking once, sharp, directional. The sound cut through the smoke like a blade. Here, this way, come now! Tomas stumbled. His injured leg buckled on a chamisa root, the knee bending in a direction it was no longer willing to go, and he pitched forward with a sharp intake of breath that he tried to swallow, and couldn't. June was there. She caught his arm at the elbow, took his weight across her hip for 2 strides, and kept him upright through sheer leverage and refusal. She didn't let go. They ran the last 20 meters together, June half carrying him, her boots finding ground that his couldn't. And when they cleared the burn zone, she lowered him to the earth carefully, one hand still on his arm, the other braced against the ground. Her breathing was ragged, her hands were shaking, but her grip hadn't loosened. Rowan reached them. His eyes moved in the sequence that was older than thought. Tomas, bandage holding, face white, sweating but breathing. June, soot-streaked, coughing but upright, her eyes already scanning the terrain ahead. Mesa, panting hard, tongue out, but 4 legs solid, already oriented northwest, already mapping. June pulled the bandana down. Ash streaked her face in lines that followed the sweat tracks. She looked at the burn they'd just crossed, the blackened chamisa, the collapsed piñón trunk still glowing orange at its core, and then at the main fire line visible through the smoke to the east. Closer now, measurably closer. "Juniper burns fast," she said. Her voice was hoarse, but the words came out in the same measured cadence she used for everything. Data first, emotion later, or not at all. "Piñón burns slow. The chamisa along the western drainage holds more moisture in the root system. Fire doesn't carry well through green biomass. If we follow where the drainage is deeper, we stay in the slow burn zone." Rowan looked at her. She was reading the fire the way he read a battle space, not panicking, not guessing, but analyzing the terrain and predicting how the threat would move through it. Fuel density, moisture content, slope and wind, and the physics of combustion mapped onto a landscape she'd studied for 18 months. She wasn't an operator. She was something else. Something that arrived at the same conclusions through a different system. And the system worked. "Show me the line," he said. It was the first time he'd asked instead of told. June walked to the edge of the drainage, crouching to press her fingers into the soil. She pulled them out and held them up. The tips were dark with moisture. Not wet, not dripping, but alive in a way that the surrounding hardpan wasn't. "Here, this color change is the moisture boundary. Everything inside it burns slower. Everything outside burns fast and hot." Mesa was already at the boundary, nose down, sniffing where June's fingers had been. The dog tested the ground with one paw, pressing down, feeling the give, then stepped fully onto the darker earth and looked back at Rowan. Ears forward, tail neutral. Confirmation. "He's better at this than either of us," June said. "He's been right more often." She looked at him. For a moment, something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, but the quiet recognition that the man standing in front of her, covered in soot and ash, had just made a joke. A dry, buried, almost invisible joke, but a joke nonetheless. She filed it the way she filed data points, silently, for later analysis. They moved into the deeper drainage. The chamisa closed around them, and the fire sounds dimmed slightly. Not gone, just filtered. Rowan let June lead for the first time, watching her pick the path along the moisture line with the same systematic precision he used on a compass bearing. She read soil the way he read terrain. Different language, same fluency. They reached a stand of old-growth pinyon 40 minutes later, where the canopy was thick enough to create a pocket of filtered air. The smoke hung in the branches like gauze, turning the afternoon into something gray and still and oddly peaceful, if you didn't know what was burning beyond the tree line. Rowan called a halt. Tomas needed water and a bandage check. June needed a minute to stop coughing. Mesa needed water more than any of them. The dog's respiratory system was taking the smoke harder, each breath a visible effort, his sides expanding and contracting with a rhythm that was too fast for rest. Rowan poured from the second water bladder into his cupped palm. "Here, drink." Mesa lapped without breaking his scanning pattern, tongue working while his eyes continued to move. When the water was gone, Rowan poured again. The bladder was getting light. A liter remaining, maybe less. He divided it mentally. 4 people, 1 dog, unknown hours. And the math was the kind that didn't improve with repetition. Tomas sat against a pinyon trunk, his injured leg extended, breathing through his teeth. The swelling had spread above the knee now, and the way he held the leg, carefully, at a specific angle, adjusting whenever the position shifted, told Rowan that the nerve compression he'd warned about was beginning. Walking would be harder from here. Significantly harder. June sat 3 feet away, the sample case open on her lap. She checked each vial, seals, labels, integrity, with the focused attention of someone performing surgery. Her field journal was out, pages black with soot at the edges, but the handwriting inside still legible, still precise. "What's in the case?" Rowan asked. She didn't look up. "Soil samples. Sector 7 and 2 other collection sites along the bluff base." "Soil samples worth carrying through a fire." Now she looked up. Her eyes were steady, tired, smoke-reddened, but clear. "Soil samples that show something that shouldn't be there." She held up a vial. The contents were a dull, grayish brown, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what healthy restoration soil was supposed to look like. But June knew, and the way she held the vial, carefully, at eye level, the way you hold evidence, said everything her words hadn't yet. This was collected from a site that's been under active restoration for 14 months. Your program, Hale. Your irrigation, your saplings, your soil amendments. 14 months of work. The microbial profile should show recovery, increased organic content, healthy fungal networks, improving pH balance. That's what restoration looks like at the chemical level. And instead, it shows elevated levels of industrial solvents, trichloroethylene, tetrachloroethylene, compounds that are used in metal degreasing and industrial cleaning, and that have absolutely no business being in restoration soil in the middle of the New Mexico high desert. Someone is introducing these chemicals into the ground, Hale, deliberately, systematically, and it isn't wildlife. The pinyon canopy shifted in a gust of heated wind. Smoke swirled through the branches, thickened, thinned. Mesa stood up from where he'd been resting near Tomas and walked to June, lowering his nose to the sample case, sniffing the vials with the slow, deliberate attention he gave to things that mattered. Then he looked at Rowan. ears forward, head tilted. The probe. The soil probe that had been destroyed by wildlife 6 weeks ago. The one that had been dragged 40 feet from its mounting stake and smashed. 3 months of continuous soil data. Chemical composition, pH levels, moisture trends. Gone. June had told him about it at camp, and he'd filed it as equipment failure. Things broke in the field, that was normal. Except it wasn't normal. And she'd known that, and she'd come back anyway with a hard-sided case and replacement equipment and the specific, calibrated stubbornness of someone who had been lied to and intended to prove it. How long have you known? Known since the lab results on the first sample set came back. 3 weeks ago. She closed the case and latched it. Suspected since the probe was destroyed. 6 weeks. You didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell Meridian. She met his eyes. Reported to whom, Hale? The trust owns the land. The trust funds the program. The trust employs the survey team. The trust employs you. The entire chain of custody runs through Meridian. Reporting contamination to the organization responsible for the contamination is not reporting. It's warning. She was right. Rowan knew it immediately. Not as an opinion, but as a structural fact. The way you knew a bridge was compromised, not because someone told you, but because the math didn't hold. Commander? Tomas's voice from the tree trunk, quieter now. Lund was asking me yesterday, before he left camp. He asked where Dr. Alderman was collecting samples. I told him Sector 7. The name landed differently now. Every interaction with it rearranged in Rowan's mind, each piece clicking into a new position like tumblers in a lock. Lund. The pressed khakis. The portfolio with its careful notes. The question tucked into friendly small talk. The field surveyor. Alderman. She's still running samples out here? Delivered with a smile that arrived a half-second before the rest of his face. The supplies he'd brought. Water filters, soil probes. Generosity that felt, in retrospect, less like generosity and more like surveillance. Knowing what equipment was on site. Knowing what could be measured. And Mesa. Mesa, who greeted everyone at camp. Who had let the supply driver scratch behind his ears, who tolerated Dex's silences and Tomas's nervous energy without complaint, but who had refused to approach Lund, had stood behind Rowan's legs with his ears level and his eyes locked, tracking the man's movements with fixed, unblinking attention. Not aggressive, not afraid. Something else. Something the dog recognized and Rowan had missed. The fire, Rowan said. His voice had changed. Not louder, not faster. Flatter. The voice he used when the emotional circuitry was running too hot and the only safe option was to reroute everything through logic. Strip the feeling, keep the function. The fire started south of Sector 7. The wind is pushing it northeast. If it reaches 7 before anyone can get back there. The contamination evidence burns, June said. She didn't hesitate. She'd already made this connection. Probably made it hours ago, while she was running through smoke with a sample case clutched against her chest. The point source. The drainage patterns. The soil structure that proves the chemicals were introduced through the groundwater system. All of it. Ash. The word sat between them. Ash. Everything Rowan had built over 14 months, the saplings, the irrigation channels, the soil amendments, the careful, measured work of making dead land live again. All of it sitting on top of a lie. His program wasn't restoration. It was a mask. A green, growing, carefully tended mask designed to cover what was rotting underneath. And he'd been the one tending it. Mesa crossed the clearing and pressed his shoulder against Rowan's thigh. 40 kilograms of dog leaning in with a pressure that was deliberate and calibrated. Enough to feel. Enough to anchor. Not enough to push. The dog's breathing was steady against Rowan's leg, and the rhythm of it cut through the noise in his head the way it always did. Not fixing anything. Just reminding him where the ground was. "We move," Rowan said, "and we keep those samples alive." He looked at the group. Tomas, hurt, willing, fading. June, exhausted, determined, carrying evidence that someone had tried to burn off the face of the earth. Dex, somewhere at the North Ridge, holding position, unreachable. One dog, one corridor, and a fire that was no longer impersonal. Rowan rebuilt the plan in 60 seconds. The original route. Follow the Chamisa to the North Ridge Trail, link up with Dex, walk out, was still the safest path for a pure survival scenario. But this wasn't pure survival anymore. If the fire was deliberate, the person who set it understood the terrain. They would know the Chamisa corridor. They would know the Ridge Trail. And if their objective was to ensure that June's evidence never left this mesa, they would know where to position themselves. Rowan had spent 21 years studying how people set traps. The first rule was simple. The trap works best when the target believes they're escaping. You don't block the exit. You wait at the end of it. "Change of route," he said. "We're not taking the Ridge Trail." June looked up from the sample case. "The Ridge is the only maintained. The Ridge is predictable." His voice was calm, but it carried the particular weight of finality that he'd learned to deploy in briefing rooms where disagreement cost time, and time cost lives. If someone set this fire to destroy evidence, they know the evacuation routes. The Ridge Trail is the obvious exit. We don't take the obvious exit. "Then where?" Tomas asked. Rowan pointed northwest, beyond the Piñon break, visible only as a dark line against the smoky horizon, a narrow canyon cut into the mesa bedrock. Arroyo Seco, the dry wash that ran from the bluff face down through 3 miles of sandstone to the valley floor. Through the arroyo. June's jaw tightened. She looked at the canyon rim, or what was visible of it through the smoke, and then back at Rowan. That canyon is steep. Loose sandstone walls. In this wind, with the smoke, with Tomas on one leg. It's steep. It's ugly. And it's the last route anyone would choose. Which is exactly why we take it. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He could see her running the math, not emotionally, but the way she ran soil analyses, structurally, comparing variables against outcomes. Risk of the canyon versus risk of the ridge. Unknown terrain versus predictable terrain. The danger of falling rock against the danger of walking into something worse at the end of a trail someone else had chosen for them. Tomas can't climb down loose rock with that leg. Dex will help me move him. The arroyo runs past the north perimeter boundary. If Dex is holding position, and Dex holds position, we'll find him before the descent. You're asking me to trust a plan built on 3 assumptions. Rowan looked at her, then at Mesa, who was already facing northwest, ears forward, body angled toward the arroyo like a compass needle. No command had been given. The dog had heard the conversation, or sensed the shift in Rowan's posture, the subtle recalibration that happened when a plan changed and the body reorganized itself around the new objective, and had oriented accordingly. I'm asking you to trust 21 years of making plans in worse conditions with higher stakes. And the dog agrees. If the arroyo kills us, June said, I'm going to be very irritated. Noted. Mesa, fuss. The dog fell in at Rowan's left heel. The group moved. The approach to Arroyo Seco took them across a flat stretch of exposed mesa. No chamisa, no pinion cover, just hard-packed earth and scattered sage that crumbled under their boots. The fire was visible to the south and east, a shifting curtain of orange and black that lit the underside of the smoke layer and turned the sky the color of old rust. Every second in the open was a second exposed. Rowan moved fast, his pace just below a jog, the pack bouncing against his back with each stride. June matched him step for step, the sample case held against her chest with both arms, her boots striking the ground with a rhythm that said she was running on something deeper than energy. Tomas was the variable. The leg had stiffened during the rest stop, the swelling locking the knee joint at a partial bend that turned every step into a small act of engineering. Weight shift, pivot, extension, repeat. He moved without complaint, but the gaps between his footfalls were getting longer, and the sound of his breathing had changed from controlled to effortful. Dex appeared at the canyon rim. They saw him before he saw them. A dark shape against the smoke, standing at the edge of the drop with his pack at his feet and a handheld radio in one hand. When he spotted the group crossing the flat, he raised the radio and shook his head once. Dead, same as theirs. You took the scenic route, Dex said when they reached the rim. His voice carried up from below without effort. Flat, dry, stripped of everything except information. The voice of a man who had already assessed the situation and concluded that emotion would not improve the outcome. New plan. We're going through the arroyo. Dex looked at Tomas, then at the canyon wall, 40 feet of steep, crumbling sandstone and decomposed granite, a surface that promised stability and delivered collapse. Then back at Rowan. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask about the fire or the route change or what had happened in the hours since they'd separated. He just moved to the base of the wall and looked up. Send him down first. Rowan rigged a hasty lowering system. Rope from his pack, 50 feet of kern mantle, rated for 4,000 pounds, the kind of thing no conservation program stocked, but that Rowan carried the way he carried the medical kit, because preparation was the space between dying and not dying. He anchored the rope around a boulder at the rim, tested the hold twice, and fed the free end down the wall. Tomas descended, braced against the line, his good leg doing the work, the injured one held straight and slightly out from the wall. His jaw was locked, his hands white on the rope, and the small sounds he made, Quick, bitten-off grunts that he tried to swallow echoed off the canyon walls in a way that made them sound louder than they were. Dex caught him at the bottom, absorbing the last 3 feet of descent with his shoulders, and lowered him to the stream bed with a control that came from years of moving heavy things in bad conditions. June went next. She descended one-handed, right hand on the rope, left arm wrapped around the sample case, her body twisted at an angle that sacrificed balance for protection of the cargo. Her boots slipped twice on the loose granite, each slip sending a cascade of small rocks clattering to the stream bed below. She didn't fall. She reached the bottom, stepped off the last hold, and immediately checked the case. Vials intact, seals holding. Mesa went third. The dog studied the wall for approximately 2 seconds, then descended without the rope, finding holds and edges with his paws that Rowan wouldn't have trusted, his claws scraping against the sandstone in a controlled slide that was half climbing and half falling. Each transition managed with a precision that suggested either training or instinct, or some combination that didn't have a name. He finished with a 4-foot jump to the stream bed, landed clean on all fours, shook once, the full-body reset that dogs performed between tasks, and moved to the front of the group. Down canyon, ears forward, scanning. Rowan came last. He down-climbed fast, using the rope for guidance more than support, his boots finding pockets and edges in the rock face with the automatic precision of someone who had rappelled off structures far less stable than sandstone canyon walls. A rooftop in Ramadi, a cliff face in the Hindu Kush, a training tower at Coronado where the instructors had sprayed the surface with water to make it interesting. The left shoulder protested on every upward reach, the old shrapnel damage sending bright lines of pain down through the forearm. But his grip held, because grip always held. You could lose a lot of things. Grip was the last to go. At the bottom, the world changed. The canyon walls rose on either side, 20 feet of dark sandstone streaked with mineral deposits that caught the fading light in bands of ochre and rust. The walls blocked the direct smoke, filtering it to a thin haze that smelled less like chemical burn and more like campfire. The temperature dropped, not dramatically, but enough to notice, enough to feel on the skin like a hand lifting. The sound of the fire, that constant, low, all-encompassing roar that had been the soundtrack for hours, faded to a murmur, then to something almost like silence. Almost. Not quite. The fire was still out there, still burning, still eating its way through the landscape above them. But down here, in the narrow throat of the arroyo, with 40 feet of rock between them and the flames, the world was quiet enough to hear individual sounds again. The scuff of boots on gravel, the drip of water from a seep in the canyon wall, actual water, real and present, running down the sandstone in a thin film that darkened the rock and collected in a shallow pool at the base. The sound of Mesa's breathing, slower now, recovering. Rowan took a breath, a real one, the first in hours that didn't taste like ash. He looked at his team, because that was what they were now, whether anyone had spoken the word. 4 people and a dog who had walked through fire together, and the walking had changed the relationship between them in ways that couldn't be undone by the absence of fire. Tomas sat on a flat rock near the wall, his injured leg elevated on his pack. His face was gray beneath the soot, but his eyes were clear, and he'd already begun checking his own bandage, pressing the edges, testing the tension, the habits of a former medic overriding the experience of being a patient. Dex stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the canyon walls with the calm, continuous attention of a man who processed threat the way other people processed weather, constantly, without commentary, as a condition of existence. June knelt near the seep, filling her water bottle from the thin stream. Her field journal was open beside her, and even now, even here, exhausted, smoke-stained, carrying evidence of a crime through a burning landscape, she was making notes, observations, data. The temperature of the seep water, the mineral content suggested by the color of the deposits, the fact that the seep existed at all, which said something about the hydrology that she would analyze later, if there was a later. Mesa stood at the front of the group, facing down canyon. His posture was relaxed, but alert. The specific configuration of a working animal between tasks. Not resting, not standing down. Just waiting for the next phase, with the calm certainty that the next phase would come, because phases always came. "Commander?" Tomas's voice. Quiet, not weak, young. The voice of someone who had been holding himself together with discipline and pride, and the specific stubbornness of a man who had already survived one kind of war, and who was discovering that survival came in varieties. "I'm scared." The canyon went still. Even the seep seemed to pause. Rowan looked at him, not with pity. Pity was corrosive, and Tomas didn't need it. Not with disappointment. There was nothing to be disappointed about. With recognition. The kind that comes from having stood in the same place, in a different canyon, in a different country, in a different decade, and having felt the same thing rise up through the discipline like water through cracks in stone. "Good," Rowan said. "Means you're paying attention." Tomas blinked. The word wasn't what he'd expected. "Fear's not the problem," Rowan said. He crouched, bringing himself to Tomas's eye level, the way he'd crouched beside men who were bleeding, and men who were breaking, and men who were both. Fear is data. It tells you the situation is real, and your body knows it. The problem is when fear stops being data and starts being a decision. When it stops informing and starts choosing. Right now, yours is data. You're scared because the situation is scary. That's accurate. That's useful. Keep it that way. It was a BUD/S instructor's line. Master Chief Garza, Phase 1, the night before Hell Week, standing in front of 60 men who were about to enter 5.5 days of continuous misery. Most of them would ring the bell before Thursday. The ones who stayed would remember Garza's words the way they remembered the taste of salt water and the sound of the surf at 3 in the morning. Rowan hadn't thought about Garza in years, hadn't repeated his words to anyone. But they came out now the way they'd gone in, clean, certain, delivered with the calm authority of someone who meant every syllable, because every syllable had been paid for. Tomas swallowed, nodded once. The fear didn't leave his face. It couldn't, because fear was honest, and the situation warranted honesty. But it changed shape, shifted from something that pressed against the inside of his chest to something he held in his hands. A different weight, a manageable one. Dex, from his position by the wall, said nothing, but his arms uncrossed, and he gave a small nod that was almost invisible in the dim light. Not agreement, acknowledgement. He'd heard the same thing once, from a different instructor, in a different branch, in a different war. The language varied. The truth didn't. June had stopped writing. Her pen was still against the page, and she was watching Rowan with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not professional assessment, the detached, analytical gaze she wore when examining soil samples or discussing contamination profiles. Not the careful wariness she'd maintained since their first meeting. The distance of a woman who had learned that distance was safer than proximity. This was something else. She was looking at the space behind the competence, the room behind the room, and what she found there had changed something in the way she held herself. A subtle shift, barely visible, like a door opening an inch. She didn't say anything. She looked back down at the journal and resumed writing. Rowan noticed. He noticed the pen, still for 10 seconds, the slight deepening of her breathing, the way her eyes had briefly softened, not with vulnerability, but with recognition. The way one person recognizes another person's wound, not because it's visible, but because they carry a matching one. He filed it, precisely, completely, without acting on it. The canyon walls rose above them, dark and striated, the mineral bands catching the last of the fading light. The smoke drifted overhead in slow, translucent rivers, visible against the narrow strip of sky between the rims. A ribbon of atmosphere that still belonged to the world above, to the fire and the heat and the ash. While down here the air was cool and the stone was quiet, and the water dripped from the seep with a patience that had nothing to do with the emergency unfolding on the surface. Rowan looked up. It happened without intention. His head tilting back, his eyes following the canyon walls upward to the gap between them, and through that gap to the sky. Not blue, not clear. Not the wide, clean sky he'd walked under 3 mornings ago, when everything was still measured and controlled and his. But sky nonetheless. A space above the smoke where the light still reached, turning the highest layer of cloud a pale, improbable gold. The kind of color that existed only at the boundary between day and night, between heat and cooling, between what was ending and what had not yet begun. He hadn't looked up in hours. His eyes had been down and forward since the first column of smoke appeared. Ground, fire, path, people, threat, assessment, planning, the mechanics of keeping everyone alive. Always down, always forward, always scanning for the next thing that could kill them. Now he looked up, and there was nothing there to assess, nothing to measure, nothing to plan for, or defend against, or route around. Just sky, just light, just the quiet, indifferent fact that something existed above the smoke, above the fire, above the canyon and the crisis and the deception. Something that didn't care about soil samples or arson or the decisions of men. and that would be there tomorrow, whether they were or not. Mesa lifted his head. The dog followed Rowan's gaze upward, ears rotating once, slowly, carefully, listening to whatever the sky sounded like from this depth, at this hour, on this particular evening in the life of a canyon that had been here for 10,000 years and would be here for 10,000 more. Mesa's eyes were amber in the fading light, and they held the sky for a moment with the same attention he gave to everything, complete, unhurried, precise. Then he laid his chin on his paws and closed his eyes. 3 seconds, maybe 4. A micro rest, a recalibration. The animal equivalent of a breath held and released. A brief surrender to the trust that the next few moments were safe enough to stop watching. Rowan exhaled, slowly. The tightness in his chest, the one that had been there since Tomas's voice cracked on the word scared. The one that went deeper than smoke inhalation and had nothing to do with fire. Loosened. Not much. Just enough. "All right," he said. Not to anyone in particular, not to the group, not to the dog, not to the canyon. To the space between what had happened and what was coming. To whatever waited around the bend of the arroyo, in the dark, in the unknown, where the maps stopped and the decisions started. "Let's move." Mesa was on his feet before the word finished. 4 legs, ears forward, eyes open. Ready before the command, which was the only way he knew how to be. They moved into the arroyo, single file, the canyon walls closing around them. Rowan at point, Mesa ahead of him, Tomas behind, leaning on Dex's shoulder, each step a negotiation. June at the rear, the sample case against her chest, her eyes on the walls and the ground, and the thin strip of fading sky above. The fire was still out there. They could hear it, a low, distant rumble that traveled through the rock like a heartbeat. They could smell it, the char seeping down from above, threading through the clean canyon air in thin, bitter currents. They could feel it, the warmth radiating through the sandstone walls, a reminder that the stone itself was absorbing the heat of the burning world above. But down here, for now, the fire couldn't reach them. For now, that was enough. The arroyo narrowed as they moved northwest. The walls pressed closer, 12 feet apart, then 10, then 8. And the strip of sky above shrank to a ribbon. The fading light barely reached the streambed floor, turning everything into shapes and shadows that Rowan's eyes had to work to resolve. He moved by feel as much as sight, one hand trailing the canyon wall, his boots testing each step before committing weight. The sandstone was cool under his fingers. Cool, but warming. The fire above was heating the rock from the surface down, and the warmth was migrating through the stone like a slow fever. Mesa moved ahead of him, a dark shape against darker ground. The dog's pace had slowed, not from exhaustion, but from caution. His head was low, ears forward, and every few steps he paused to test the air, with the deliberate, systematic attention of a dog who was tracking something that didn't have a scent. Heat, direction, the invisible architecture of a fire that was reshaping the world above them while they moved through the world below. Behind Rowan, Dex and Tomas moved in a paired rhythm that they'd established without discussion. Dex's arm under Tomas's shoulder on the injured side, taking weight with each step, adjusting stride to match the younger man's shortened gait. It was efficient and quiet, and stripped of anything that resembled sympathy. Just mechanics. Just two men solving a problem with their bodies. June brought up the rear. The sample case was strapped across her chest now. She'd used the shoulder strap from her field pack to fashion a carry system that freed both hands for balance. Her breathing was controlled, but the cough that had started in the smoke was persistent. A dry, rasping sound that echoed off the canyon walls and came back to her like a reply. The smoke found them again at the first bend. Not the thick, choking wall they'd pushed through on the surface, but a thinner version. Tendrils of gray that curled down from the rim and pooled in the narrow throat of the arroyo, gathering in the low spots where the air was still. The smell was different here. Sharper. Less wood, more chemical. The same acrid edge that Mesa had detected at the fire's origin point, concentrated by the canyon walls into something that burned the throat and made the eyes water. Rowan pulled the gator up. "Cover your faces. Stay close." They moved through the first smoke pocket in 30 seconds. The air cleared on the other side, and for a few minutes the arroyo was clean again. Just rock and gravel and the faint sound of the fire above, transmitted through the stone. Then the canyon turned south. Rowan stopped. The turn was wrong. The arroyo was supposed to run northwest to the valley floor. He'd studied the topographic overlay during his first month at the camp, memorizing drainage patterns the way he'd memorized patrol routes. But the canyon curved left here, bending toward the fire, and the walls rose higher, and the smoke was thicker, and the warmth in the stone was no longer subtle. "Wrong direction," he said. "The arroyo forks," June said from the rear. She was looking at the walls, reading the rock strata the way she read everything, layer by layer, searching for the data beneath the surface. "This is a meander. It'll curve back north in maybe 200 meters. But the fork..." She pointed at a narrow gap in the left wall, barely 4 feet wide, where the rock split and a secondary channel cut northwest. "That's the main drainage." Rowan looked at the gap. It was tight, very tight. The walls were close enough to touch simultaneously, and the ground between them was choked with tumbled rock and dead brush. Mesa was already at the entrance, nose working the gap. The dog took 2 steps in, paused, and came back. He looked at Rowan, ears up, tail neutral, not alarmed, not enthusiastic. Reporting. "Can we get through?" Mesa turned and walked into the gap without looking back. That was the answer. "Single file. Stay tight. Dex, keep Tomas upright." They entered the gap. The secondary channel was worse than Rowan had expected. The walls were close, shoulders brushing both sides in the narrowest spots, and the ground was a jumble of fallen sandstone blocks that required climbing over, squeezing between, or scrambling under. The smoke was thicker here, pooling in the tight space, trapped by the walls and the still air. Each breath tasted like something burning that shouldn't be burning. Rowan moved through it with the methodical patience of a man who had learned, in places far worse than this, that speed in tight spaces got people killed. Test the handhold. Test the foothold. Move. Repeat. The rhythm was meditative if you let it be, and lethal if you didn't. Behind him, Tomas was struggling. Dex was strong enough to support the younger man's weight, but the narrow walls made it impossible to maintain the side-by-side carry they'd used in the main arroyo. Tomas had to climb on his own, using his arms and his good leg, while the injured one hung uselessly. Each impact against the rock sending a jolt through him that he absorbed in silence. Then the wind came through the gap. Not from behind them, from above. A downdraft, sudden and violent, pushing the smoke down into the channel in a solid column. Visibility dropped to 3 feet. Rowan couldn't see Mesa ahead of him, couldn't see his own boots. The world became gray and orange and hot, the air thickening until breathing required conscious effort. Inhale through the gator, hold, exhale, repeat. And with the smoke came the sound. Not fire, not wind, something else. A low, sustained roar that echoed off the narrow walls and doubled and redoubled until it filled the gap from edge to edge. The sound of superheated air being pushed through a constriction. A natural chimney effect, the canyon acting as a flue, drawing the fire's breath downward into the only available space. The walls vibrated. Rowan felt it through his fingertips, a fine tremor in the sandstone, the rock itself resonating with the pressure differential. The temperature jumped 10 degrees in 5 seconds. "Move! Fast and forward! Don't stop!" He drove through the gap, hands on the walls for guidance, boots finding holds by instinct because sight was gone. Behind him, he heard Dex grunting with effort, Tomas's breath coming in sharp, bitten-off gasps, June coughing. Deep, racking coughs that she tried to suppress and couldn't. Mesa barked, once, ahead and to the right. The sound cut through the roar like a knife edge, sharp, specific, commanding. Rowan followed it. 2 more steps. 3. The walls widened. The air moved. The smoke thinned from solid to gauze, and he could see again. The main arroyo opening up ahead of them, the secondary channel spilling back into the larger canyon. They stumbled out of the gap and into the open stream bed. The air here was smoky but breathable. The roar behind them faded as the downdraft found a new path and the chimney effect collapsed. Rowan turned to count. Dex, through, with Tomas hanging from his shoulder. June, through, bent double, coughing, but standing. Mesa, standing in the stream bed, facing the gap, his body positioned between the group and the thing they'd just escaped. Everyone was out. Everyone was breathing. June sat against the canyon wall, her chest heaving, the cough deep and persistent now. Mesa walked to her and lay down beside her, his chin resting on his paws, his body angled so that his flank pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his neck without thinking. The same gesture Rowan used, the same placement, the same slow settling of fingers into fur. "My husband used to say that the worst part of the mountains wasn't the climbing," she said. Her voice was raw. She wasn't looking at Rowan. She was looking at the strip of sky above the canyon. "It was the part where you couldn't see the top anymore, where you were just moving, because stopping was worse." Rowan didn't answer. Didn't need to. The sentence had the weight of something carried for a long time and set down carefully in a specific place for a specific person. "He died on a mountain," she said, 3 years ago. "A climbing accident in the Sangre de Cristos. They told me it was fast. Her hand moved slowly through Mesa's fur. I spent 3 years in a lab after that. Didn't go outside. Didn't go to the field. Just data. Just numbers. Things I could control. She looked at Rowan then. Direct. Unguarded. This project was the first thing that got me out of the lab. Your trees. Your land. I'm not going to let someone burn down the reason I started living again. Rowan held her gaze. He understood, not the specifics, but the structure, the architecture of a person who had lost the thing that gave them purpose and had rebuilt around something else, something smaller and more fragile, and who was now watching that second thing burn too. Then we don't let them, he said. Mesa's tail moved once against June's leg. The dog looked between them, Rowan, June, Rowan, and then settled deeper into his position, holding the space. The arroyo curved northwest again. The walls dropped to 15 feet, then 10, and the strip of sky above widened. The smoke thinned. The light shifted from gray to deep amber as the sun, wherever it was behind the layers of smoke and cloud, dropped toward the horizon. And then the fire found the rim. Rowan heard it before he saw it. A sudden crackling surge above them, flames racing along the canyon edge, consuming the scrub and deadfall that lined the rim. Orange light spilled down the walls, illuminating the arroyo in a wavering, shifting glow that turned the sandstone the color of heated metal. Embers drifted down from the rim like burning snow, landing in the dry streambed with small hisses, each one a tiny fire that died on the gravel. The smoke thickened, not slowly, all at once, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the narrow strip of sky. The air turned opaque, hot, tasting of char and chemical. Visibility collapsed to 5 feet. Then less. And Rowan was gone. Not physically. His body was still standing in the arroyo, hands at his sides, boots on the gravel. But behind his eyes, the canyon disappeared. The smoke became a different smoke, darker, heavier, carrying the smell of cordite and burning diesel instead of pinon and juniper. The walls became a different set of walls, rock but narrower, and the sound echoing off them was not fire, but gunfire, sharp and percussive, and there were voices. His voice, shouting commands that came too late or too early. It was never clear which. Go, go, go! Through the valley! Stay left of the ridge! The valley. Helmand. Dawn light. The platoon moving through a corridor between rock walls, and the walls were too close, and the wind carried the sound the wrong direction, and the timing was wrong. 90 seconds wrong. He'd calculated the transit time, and he'd been off by 90 seconds. And 90 seconds was the distance between alive and not alive for 3 men whose names he carried in a place that didn't have a location on any map of his body, but was there nonetheless. Always. Like a bone that had healed crooked and ached when the weather changed. Move, move! They're on the ridge! The commands came out of him like breathing, automatic, involuntary, echoes of a morning 8 years ago that his conscious mind had filed away, but his nervous system refused to archive. The smoke in the arroyo was the smoke in the valley. The heat was the same heat. The roar of the fire was the roar of the ambush. The walls were closing in because walls always closed in, and somewhere ahead there was a gap, and through the gap there was safety, and the only question was whether 90 seconds was enough. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. 3 men, 3 names. His hands stopped moving. His breathing changed. Shallow, rapid, the rhythm of a body preparing for a threat that existed in a different decade. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing the arroyo. They were seeing a ridgeline in Helmand where the sun was coming up and the dust was golden and the world was about to break. June's voice. Distant. Wrong direction. Hail. Not registering. Hail. Nothing. The valley held him. The names held him. The 90 seconds played on a loop that had no pause button and no end. Just the same interval repeating. The decision. The call. The gap between right and wrong measured in a unit of time small enough to be meaningless and large enough to be everything. Mesa didn't bark. The dog didn't growl, didn't whine, didn't make any sound at all. He crossed the arroyo floor in 4 steps, precise, unhurried, each paw placed with intention, and pressed the full length of his body against Rowan's legs. Not a nudge, not a lean, a commitment. 40 kilograms of dog, shoulder to hip, flank against shin, the entire weight of him transferred into contact so complete that Rowan's body couldn't ignore it. The dog's breathing was slow and measured, deliberately slow, a rhythm set against the chaos, steady as a metronome. 5 seconds. The valley flickered. The arroyo flickered back. 10 seconds. The gunfire faded. The fire replaced it. A different sound, a present sound, real and located and belonging to this canyon, this day, this moment. 15 seconds. Rowan looked down. Mesa was there. Amber eyes looking up. Not frantic, not worried. Patient. Present. Holding the space between then and now with nothing but weight and warmth and the steady, deliberate rhythm of breathing that said, I am here. You are here. This is the ground. I'm here, Rowan said. The words came out broken, rough, wet at the edges, though his face was dry. Mesa's tail moved once. One slow sweep against the gravel. Acknowledgement. Rowan blinked. The arroyo was the arroyo. The smoke was smoke. The fire was a fire. And it was real. And it was now. And the valley in Helmand was 8 years ago. And the 3 names were still there, but they were not here. And the difference between there and here was a dog pressing against his legs with a patience that had no conditions attached to it. He became aware of the others. June was standing 3 feet away. She hadn't touched him, hadn't moved closer. She was holding Tomas's arm. She'd taken over from Dex, catching the younger man's weight when Rowan stopped moving. And her eyes were on Rowan with an expression that was neither pity nor fear. It was recognition. The steady gaze of someone who understood what she was seeing because she'd seen it before, in a mirror, on a morning 3 years ago, when grief had pulled her out of the present and dropped her somewhere else, and the only way back had been through. She didn't ask what happened, didn't ask if he was okay. Mesa found the exit, she said. The arroyo opens up 50 meters ahead. The fire hasn't reached the other side. Practical, clean, a fact to replace the fiction his mind had been playing. She gave him what she would have wanted. Not comfort, not explanation, just a next step. Rowan straightened. drew a breath that burned his throat and tasted like the present. He looked at Dex, standing behind June, silent, watchful, already recalibrated. The man gave a single nod, not sympathy, solidarity. "Copy," Rowan said. The word came out steadier than it should have. "Mesa, fuss." The dog released the pressure against his legs and moved to point position. Ahead, northwest. The exit. They moved. The arroyo opened onto a wide, flat shelf of mesa that the fire had not yet reached. The air was smoky but clear enough to see 100 yards. The sky above was orange and gray, the sun invisible behind layers of smoke and cloud, the light sourceless and even. To the south and east, the fire burned. A wall of it visible along the ridge, flames silhouetted against the smoke in shifting, liquid shapes. But here, on this shelf of bare rock and scattered sage, the ground was unburned, and the air was breathable. Rowan stopped at the edge of the arroyo and scanned. Automatic. Compass point sweep, north, east, south, west. The county road was visible to the northwest, a thin line of pale gravel cutting across the darkening landscape. 3 miles, maybe less. Then he heard the engines. 3 vehicles approaching from the northwest along a dirt track that branched off the county road. SUVs, moving fast. The headlights were on, unnecessary in the remaining daylight, conspicuous the way you drove when you wanted to be seen rather than when you needed to see. Rowan held up a fist. The group stopped. Mesa stiffened, ears flat. A low growl, sustained, vibrating in his chest. The same sound he hadn't made when Lund visited the camp, but was making now, as if the distance between suspicion and certainty had finally closed. The vehicle stopped 200 meters away. Doors opened. 6 people stepped out. 5 of them wore Meridian Land Trust work clothes and carried no visible equipment, no medical bags, no firefighting gear, no water. They carried large, dark containers. Cleanup containers. The kind used for hazardous material transport. The 6th person was Garrett Lund. He walked toward the group with the same easy stride he'd used at the camp, confident, unhurried, the body language of a man approaching a problem he intended to manage, rather than a threat he needed to confront. The Meridian polo was gone, replaced by a field jacket. The smile was still there, but it sat differently on his face, thinner, more deliberate, a tool rather than an expression. "Rowan!" Lund stopped 20 feet away, hands at his sides, voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had spent a career making difficult things sound reasonable. "Thank God! We've been looking for you for hours." Mesa's growl deepened. The dog's body was locked at Rowan's left side, not lunging, not advancing, but vibrating with a controlled intensity that said the only thing preventing movement was the leash of training, and training had limits. "Easy," Rowan murmured. His hand dropped to Mesa's neck. The dog didn't relax, didn't break focus, just registered the touch and held his position. Rowan looked at Lund, then at the 5 people behind him, then at the containers they carried, then back at Lund. 21 years, 7 deployments, hundreds of briefings, debriefs, interrogations, negotiations, and every single one of them had taught him the same thing. People who are lying tell you what they think you need to hear. People who are telling the truth tell you what happened. The difference is in the sequence. Liars lead with reassurance. Truth-tellers lead with facts. Lund had led with, "Thank God." Rescue teams carry medical equipment, Rowan said. His voice was flat, not angry, not confrontational, observational. Your people are carrying hazmat containers. Lund's smile held for a beat. Then it adjusted, not disappearing, but rearranging itself into something more serious, more concerned. The expression of a man who was about to explain something complicated to someone who didn't understand the full picture. "We're here to recover sensitive equipment from the restoration site before the fire reaches it. Soil probes, chemical sensors, expensive gear that could cause environmental contamination if burned." He spread his hands. "Standard protocol." There is no protocol for recovering soil probes during a wildfire. Rowan, and your people aren't heading toward the site. They're heading toward us. Lund's expression shifted again. The concern faded. What replaced it was harder to read. Not anger exactly, but the specific calculating stillness of someone recalculating, adjusting variables, running new numbers. "Dr. Alderman," Lund said, turning his attention to June. His voice changed, softer now, warmer, the voice he used for managing people rather than managing situations. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. Let us take the sample case. We'll secure it back at the office, run the analysis through proper channels." "No!" June's voice cut through his like a blade through paper. One syllable. Complete. Lund paused. His eyes moved from June to the case strapped across her chest, then back to her face. "June, those samples need to be handled under controlled conditions. The chain of custody." "The chain of custody runs through Meridian." June stepped forward. Her voice was hoarse from smoke, her face was streaked with soot, and her hands were steady. "The same Meridian that owns the land where the contamination is occurring. The same Meridian that employs the regional manager who asked where I'd be collecting samples the day before a fire conveniently broke out in the exact location I was sampling." The smile was gone from Lund's face. What remained was something leaner, something stripped of performance. "You don't understand what you're looking at," he said. "I understand trichloroethylene. I understand tetrachloroethylene. I understand a contamination profile that matches industrial solvent disposal, introduced through a point source upstream of the bluff face and carried through the groundwater into a site that is supposed to be under ecological restoration." She paused. "And I understand arson." The word landed in the space between them, and the space didn't recover. Lund turned back to Rowan. His posture had changed. Shoulders back, weight forward. The stance of a man who had moved past negotiation and was considering alternatives. The 5 people behind him shifted, not aggressively, just attentively. "Rowan." Lund's voice dropped, confidential. "Let's be practical. You have a good thing here. Your program, your crew, the work you've done. It matters. It's real. If this becomes a federal investigation, the program shuts down. Your crew loses their jobs. 14 months of restoration work goes back to bare rock. All of that, gone." He held Rowan's gaze. "Give me the samples. I'll handle the contamination internally. The program stays open. Your people keep working. The trees keep growing. The offer hung in the air like smoke, and it was tempting. Not because Rowan trusted Lund. That trust had burned with the Pignon Ridge, but because the thing Lund was offering to save was real. The program was real. The trees were real. The crew, Tomas with his mangled leg, Dex with his silence, Briggs and Paulson with their second chances, they were real. 14 months of making dead land live, of building something that grew instead of something that destroyed. It was the first thing Rowan had built since leaving the teams that felt like it belonged to him. And Lund knew it. Lund had always known it. That was the architecture of the entire operation. Hire a retired SEAL with PTSD, give him a mission, give him a team, give him land that needed saving, and let his own need for purpose blind him to what was happening beneath the surface. Rowan had been managed, manipulated, handled, the same way assets were handled in intelligence operations. Identify the motivation, provide the framework, let the asset do the work while you operate in the space they're not looking at. He'd been looking at survival rates and irrigation channels and soil composition codes, while someone was pumping industrial waste into the ground beneath his trees. The anger was clean, cold, precise. It sat in his chest behind the sternum, and it didn't shake his hands or quicken his breath, because it wasn't surprise. It was recognition. The hard, specific recognition of a man who had been in this position before, where the easy choice was the wrong one, and the right choice was the one that cost you the thing you'd built. The valley. 90 seconds. The right call that came at the wrong time. 3 men. But this time, the calculation was different. This time, the right call didn't cost lives. It cost trees. It cost a program. It cost the illusion of purpose that he'd wrapped around himself like armor since the day he'd walked off his last command. It cost the lie that he'd been in control. The samples stay with Dr. Alderman, Rowan said. His voice was steady, not defiant, not dramatic, just final. The voice of a man who had made a decision and would not be making it again. Rowan, the samples stay. My crew stays. We walk to the county road and we contact federal environmental enforcement. What happens to the program after that is not your call, and it's not mine. Lund's jaw tightened. You're throwing away everything you've built. No. Rowan looked at him. You already threw it away, the day you put waste under my trees. Lund took a step forward. Mesa surged. Not a lunge, not an attack, but a decisive movement that placed the dog directly between the 2 men. Body low, weight forward, a growl building in his chest that wasn't a warning, but a promise. The dog's amber eyes were locked on Lund, and whatever Lund saw in them stopped him mid-stride. Your dog knows exactly what he's doing. Behind Rowan, Dex had moved. Silently, without instruction, the Marine had positioned himself at Rowan's right flank, arms uncrossed, weight balanced. Not threatening. Ready. Tomas, hurt, gray-faced, standing on one good leg, straightened beside Dex. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He was standing. Lund looked at them. The group. The dog, the woman with the case, the wounded man who wouldn't sit down, the quiet man who wouldn't look away. He ran his own calculation. Whatever the answer was, it changed his posture. The shoulders dropped, the weight shifted back. The stance of a man who had decided that this particular problem would be solved at a different time, in a different venue, by different means. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Rowan agreed. "It isn't." Lund turned and walked back to the vehicles. The 5 Meridian workers followed. Doors closed. Engines started. The SUVs reversed, turned, and drove back toward the county road, their headlights sweeping across the burned landscape before disappearing beyond the ridge. The mesa was quiet. The fire still burned to the south. They could see the glow, smell the smoke, feel the residual heat in the rock. But it was moving away from them now, driven by the wind toward terrain it hadn't consumed yet. The danger was receding. Not gone, but retreating. Rowan stood where he was for a long moment, watching the last of Lund's taillights fade. Mesa remained at his feet, still facing the direction the vehicles had gone, his growl subsiding into silence by degrees. The dog didn't relax fully until the sound of the engines was gone. Then, and only then, he turned and pressed his shoulder against Rowan's thigh. "Yeah," Rowan said quietly. "I know." The county fire department reached them 40 minutes later. Briggs and Paulson had made it to the highway. Dispatch had been called. The first truck arrived from the east, and behind it, an ambulance. Tomas was loaded onto a stretcher without protest. The fight had gone out of his leg, if not his eyes. Dex rode with him, sitting in the ambulance with his arms crossed and his gaze fixed out the rear window, watching the fire recede. Rowan stood beside the fire truck, speaking to the incident commander, a county captain named Harrell, who took notes and asked questions and didn't interrupt. June was beside them, the sample case open, explaining the contamination data in precise, measured terms that translated scientific jargon into language a fire captain could relay to the people who needed to hear it. "I need to contact a federal environmental attorney," June said. "Tonight, before anyone from Meridian reaches a phone." Harrell looked at Rowan. Rowan nodded once. "Use my satellite phone," Harrell said, "and I'm going to need both of you to make statements." They made statements. June provided the sample case as evidence, each vial documented, each collection site GPS tagged, the chain of custody now running through county fire and emergency services instead of through the organization that had put the chemicals in the ground. Rowan provided context, Lund's visits, the destroyed probe, the fire's ignition point relative to June's sample sites. It was precise work. Clean. The work of people who understood that facts were more dangerous than anger, and that the truth, properly documented, was a weapon that didn't require reloading. The fire captain left with a promise to relay everything to the county sheriff and the state environmental agency. The ambulance left with Tomas and Dex. And then the mesa was quiet again. Just Rowan, June, Mesa, and the last light of a day that had started clean and ended in ash. Rowan walked, not toward anything, away from the trucks, away from the road, into the burned landscape south of the arroyo. The ground was black, Charred chamisa stalks like tiny skeletons, piñón trunks reduced to smoking columns, the soil beneath baked hard and gray. The air smelled of carbon, of ending, of the specific mineral finality that comes when living things become their own opposite. Mesa walked beside him, close, not lead-checking, just present. The dog's paws left prints in the ash, 4 pointed marks that filled in behind them as the soot settled back into the depression. Rowan stopped where a piñón had been. He knew it was a piñón because the stump was still there, blackened, split, but recognizable by its shape. It was one of the trees he'd planted 11 months ago. He remembered the day. He remembered the soil composition code on its tag. He remembered checking its root structure during a monthly inspection and noting that the growth rate was ahead of projections. It was ash now. He crouched. His knees protested, the right one louder than usual, the joint swollen from hours of hard terrain and harder descents. He ignored it and looked at the ground around the stump. Black, gray, ash. And then, beneath the ash, at the base of the stump, where the roots had gone deepest, where the fire's heat had been blocked by the mass of the trunk, something else. Green. A single shoot, thin, fragile, maybe 3 inches tall, with 2 small leaves that were bright against the charred earth in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The piñón had burned, but the root system, deep, anchored in the substrate moisture that the trench irrigation had been designed to reach, had survived. And from that surviving root, in the carbon-rich soil that the fire had created, a new shoot had emerged. Rowan stared at it. He didn't touch it, didn't reach out, just looked, the way you look at something that answers a question you hadn't known you were asking. Mesa lowered his nose to the shoot, sniffed it carefully, delicately, with the precise attention he gave to things that mattered. Then, he licked the ash around its base. A single, slow pass of his tongue that cleared a small circle of dark soil around the green. "Yeah," Rowan said. His voice was quiet. Not steady, not broken, somewhere in between. "I see it." The shoot stood in its circle of cleared earth. The ash surrounded it on all sides. The sky above was smoke and fading light, and the fire was still burning somewhere behind the ridge. And the program was over. And the trees were gone. And the man who had planted them was kneeling in the ruins of the thing he'd built. But the root had held. Beneath the fire, beneath the lie, beneath the 14 months of careful, measured work that had been a mask over something rotten, the root had found water, and the water had kept it alive, and the shoot had come up through the ash because that's what piñón seeds did. Some of them needed fire to open, needed the heat to crack the shell, needed destruction to begin. Rowan stood, slowly. The right knee clicked. His left shoulder ached in the cooling air. He looked out across the burned landscape, the black earth, the smoking stumps, the charred ridge where the fire had run. And he didn't see nothing. He saw a beginning. Mesa stood beside him, looking at the same view. The dog's breathing had slowed to normal. His ears were relaxed. His eyes moved across the landscape without urgency, without the fixed, scanning attention that meant threat. He was looking at it the way dogs look at things that are simply there, without judgment, without narrative, without the need to assign meaning. Rowan put his hand on the dog's neck. "Let's go." The morning came. Rowan had slept in the truck, or something close to sleeping, the shallow, alert rest that passed for sleep when the body was too tired to stay awake and too wired to fully shut down. Mesa lay across the passenger seat, chin on the console, his breathing even. The dog slept the way he did everything, completely, without reservation, trusting that the silence would hold until it didn't. The camp was intact. The fire had burned the southern sectors, but hadn't reached the camp itself. A combination of wind direction and the fire break that Rowan had cut along the north perimeter during his first week. The tents stood. The equipment shed stood. The table outside his tent, with its charts and its Riverstone paperweights, stood. It all looked the same. It all meant something different now. Rowan loaded the truck. It didn't take long. He'd never accumulated much. The habit of a man who had spent 20 years living out of a sea bag and had never fully unpacked, even after 3 years of civilian life. A duffel, the pack, the medical kit, Mesa's bowl and blanket. The trident was in the duffel. It had been there since the day he'd packed out of his last command, wrapped in a cloth, tucked into a side pocket, carried, but not displayed. He hadn't looked at it in months. He didn't look at it now. But he knew it was there, and its weight was part of the weight of the bag, and the bag was part of the weight he carried, and carrying weight was something he knew how to do. June arrived at 07:30. She pulled up in the county jeep, stepped out, and walked to where Rowan was standing beside the truck. She looked tired, properly tired, the kind that sleep couldn't fix because it lived in a deeper place than fatigue. But her eyes were clear, and her posture was straight, and the sample case was not in her hands. "The samples are with the attorney," she said. "Federal Environmental Enforcement will open an investigation by end of week. The attorney says the contamination profile alone is enough for an injunction." Rowan nodded. "The program will shut down," June said. It wasn't a question. "It will." "Your crew." "Briggs and Paulson have contacts in Albuquerque. Dex will find work. Dex always finds work. Tomas..." He paused. "Tomas will be fine. Kid's tougher than he knows." June studied him, the same steady, analytical gaze she'd given him when they first met, but different now, layered with everything that had happened between that first hail and this moment. The fire, the smoke, the arroyo, the 90 seconds when he'd been gone and she'd held the group together without being asked. "The trees you planted are still in the ground," she said. "The ones that survived. The roots are deep enough. They'll come back. Some of them. Enough of them." She looked at the burned ridge to the south. "Piñon reseeds after fire. It's how the species works. The heat opens the cones. Destruction is part of the cycle. You know that." He did. He'd learned it from her data, from her reports, from the way she talked about restoration. Not as something imposed on the land, but as something the land was already doing. You didn't make dead things grow. You removed what was preventing them from growing, and then you got out of the way. June reached into her pocket and pulled out a card. Plain white. a phone number, and an address in Santa Fe. I'll be working out of the university lab for the next 6 months. The investigation will need ongoing analysis. She held out the card. Come find me when you're ready. Rowan looked at the card, then at her, then at Mesa, who was watching June from the passenger seat with his ears forward and his tail giving one slow, deliberate wag. The kind he reserved for people he had decided were permanent. Rowan took the card. He didn't say he'd come, didn't promise, didn't nod or smile or offer any of the signals that would have closed the circuit between them and made this moment into something finished. Thank you, he said, for staying. Thank you for listening. She turned and walked back to the Jeep. He watched her go. Mesa watched her go. The dog's tail wagged once more, slow, definitive, and then he faced forward. Ready. Rowan started the truck. The engine turned over with the same rattling persistence it always had, a sound that belonged to early mornings and long drives, and the particular silence of a man and a dog moving through a landscape that didn't ask questions. He pulled out of the camp and onto the access road. In the rearview mirror, the tents grew smaller, the equipment shed, the table with its charts, the rows of saplings, the ones that had survived, standing in their measured lines along the restoration site, their tags glinting in the morning light. He didn't look back for long. Looking back was a skill he was learning to use differently, not as a place to live, but as a place to visit. A room you could walk through without staying. The access road met the county highway. Rowan turned northwest, toward Albuquerque, toward Santa Fe, eventually, maybe, toward whatever came next. Mesa sat in the passenger seat, his chin on the console, his eyes half closed. The morning air came through the cracked window, clean, dry, carrying the faint mineral smell of the high desert and the even fainter smell of ash from the fire that was still burning somewhere behind them, somewhere in the distance, somewhere that was no longer here. The radio was off. It was always off. Rowan drove in silence the way he did everything, deliberately, completely. Then, without thought, without decision, his hand moved to the dial, turned it. Static. He adjusted. A station came through, distant, fading in and out, a country song about roads and morning light and the particular mercy of starting over. He left it on. It was the first time in 3 years that he'd let music fill the cab. The first time he'd allowed a sound he hadn't chosen, hadn't controlled, hadn't vetted for threat content or emotional risk. Just a song. Just a voice. Just the simple, ordinary fact of someone singing about something that wasn't war or fire or the space between what you built and what you lost. Mesa's ear twitched at the sound. He opened one eye, regarded the radio for a moment, then closed it again. His chin settled deeper into the console. His breathing slowed. His body relaxed in a way that said, "This is safe. This is allowed. We can have this." The truck moved northwest along the county highway. The high desert stretched out on both sides, wide, brown, sparse, and alive in ways that weren't visible from a distance, but were undeniable up close. The piñon and juniper rolled past. The sky opened above the smoke line, blue for the first time in days. Impossibly blue. The color of something that had been there all along, waiting behind the gray. Behind them, the fire burned. Somewhere south, somewhere shrinking. Ahead of them, the road was open. The morning was clean, and in the cab of a truck that smelled like ash and dog and distance, a man who had spent 3 years building a life on top of a lie was driving toward something he couldn't name yet. He wasn't running. He'd done enough of that. He was just moving forward. With the windows cracked, the radio on, and a dog beside him who had never once needed to be told where home was, because home, for Mesa, had never been a place. It had always been a person. The road stretched on. The music played. And somewhere in the distance, beneath the ash, beneath the burned earth, beneath the ruins of a program built on deception and dismantled by truth, a green shoot stood in a circle of cleared soil, 2 leaves bright against the black, reaching for light that was already there.